Okay, so as people come in, we'll just get started. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. I am so excited about being able to speak with Virginia tonight. But first, before we get started, I want to announce a couple people that I brought in as guests, and I'm very excited that they're here. One is Jody Finkelstein. Jody is the Executive Director for the Montgomery County Commission for Women. And also Donna Roja is the chair of the board of the Montgomery County Commission for Women. So I am just thrilled that they're going to join us tonight. Thank you. We also, as they join us, I'm just going to let you know, we have people coming from Northern California, we have Florida, we have Washington State, we have Colorado, Massachusetts, and I believe the rest are from DC, but the really fun one is Ireland and Australia. So I don't know what that's about, but maybe they just want to learn how American women vote. I have no idea. So anyhow, let me take this time to get started, and I'm going to introduce Virginia Kase Solomon. You know, I met her a couple of months ago, and I have been just so impressed, and I am just honored that she's here tonight. You know, she spent the past 27 years of her professional life fighting for social justice and civil rights. And as the CEO of the League of Women Voters, she's really led a very rapid transformation of a very old 102 organization. And she kind of turned it around and really engaging in advocacy and legislation and expanded litigation and really organizing efforts to ensure voting rights for all. And the part that's really nice is that, you know, she is the leading advocate for participatory elections and democracy. And I'd like to introduce her tonight. Please welcome Virginia Kase Solomon.
Thanks, Jan. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And I love the fact that this is actually a really intimate conversation because we can have really robust discussion around democracy, and really grateful just for the invite. You all will find that I can be pretty informal. So I love when we have smaller groups, and it allows us to not have to be super stuffy as per usual in DC. But what I will say is that right now, elections are coming in just 13 days. There is a lot at stake this election, which you all are probably hyper aware of. And so really excited just to talk a little bit about the organization, how people can engage. And I think also just to be able to answer any questions that you all may have about what's happening right now.
That's great. So instead of Virginia going and doing a great speech, we decided that this is just going to be conversational tonight. So if you have a question after she responds to a question, please use the chat or your little wonderful hand in the air thing, reaction. So feel free to do that. But please mute your mics for now until you have the opportunity to speak. And this is being recorded, by the way. Just want to make sure you all understand that. Monica, hand up.
Hi, thanks, Virginia. Thanks, everybody, for being here. So we've got, as you said, 11 days out. What can we do to get the vote out? I mean, is it too late? What else can we be doing to help women understand how important their vote is and get out there and vote?
So one of the things I think is really important right now is just reaching out to your circles and making sure that everybody has their voting plan in place. I think that's the most important thing. You know, there's tons of advertising and there's a whole get out the vote program happening throughout the country, both at the local, state, and national level. We're engaged in multiple partner coalition events. I was just sharing that I'll be down in New Orleans tomorrow, really focusing on those we call it GOTV efforts. But really the most important thing that any one individual can do is directing people to the voting, to vote and making sure they have their voting plan in place. We actually have a voter education website. And just to backtrack a little bit, for those of you who aren't familiar with the League, we're a 102-year-old nonpartisan organization. So we do engage in policy. Our policy positions are based off of oftentimes years of study and research before the league comes to a policy position. Our membership actually votes on our policies and our positions every 2 years at our convention. So we do that part of the work, but democracy work and voting rights are our core kind of bread and butter. And so those get out the vote efforts and voter education efforts are core to who we are as an organization. And so we've been telling people, go to the voter education website that we have called vote411.org, because that's where you can find all of the information about the candidates in their own words. And that allows you to make an informed decision. And we see this up and down the ballot. It's not just for federal elections, for example. And you can find out about ballot questions, what they mean, how to answer those questions, check your voter registration status, because we know that purges happen, right? This is the reality of the world that we live in now. So making sure that you're registered to vote, checking your voter registration status, how to vote. So drop boxes, they shut down after a certain time. We were talking earlier before this about how it was great to be able to vote this weekend and just drop my ballot off on the way to the grocery store. But those boxes actually close up after a certain period of time and early voting ends. And so there are deadlines that have to get met for each state, which may be different. But making sure that you're having your voting plan and then making sure that everyone around you does. Do you have senior citizen parents who maybe need help with that? Do you have kids who are in college who maybe have to be able to come home to vote? Well, maybe they don't. Maybe you can make sure that you're FedExing their ballot to them and they can send it back through mail. Things like that make it more convenient and easier for people to be able to vote. And the one thing that we hear time and time again from people who don't vote, the biggest excuse that they have is that nobody asked them.
Really?
That is something we consistently hear. People say, well, nobody asked me. I was busy. I didn't have. And so helping make sure that people are making the time and think about how busy people are these days. And so now with more convenient ways, it's easier to help people create a plan and hold them accountable to it. Did you do it? Did you do it? I know my kids, I ask them 50 times. If they do it just because they're annoyed with hearing me ask, did you do it already? And so that's one of the most important things I think we can do right now is just making sure everyone around us has a plan to vote.
So what are the main issues for women on the ballot this year?
So I was just talking about this morning. So recent polling and our recent data, when we look at what is most important to women, we're hearing about 3 things. Number one, the economy. People are really concerned about inflation. They're concerned about their pocketbook. It always goes back to those kitchen table issues. If your paycheck has not changed, but you see that a gallon of milk now costs $5 or $6, people are worried about that. It's no longer $3. Prices have doubled in some cases. And so people are impacted when they go to the gas station, they go to fill up their tank. So those kitchen table issues, those core economic issues are one of the things that we have heard consistently across the board. Another one that we have heard, no surprises here, democracy is on the ballot. People are really concerned. They've seen the January 6th hearings. They've heard about the attacks on voting rights in this country. They've heard the threats of people wanting to overturn election results or election deniers, people who say that the election results were fraudulent, right? We hear these things and people are really concerned about what the long-term effects of that are going to be on our country. And are we going to live in the kind of democracy that we've been used to living in all of these years? And then last, the other one is abortion. Access to a woman's right to choose. It is absolutely on the ballot. Nearly 70% of women polled say that is a core issue and a deciding factor for them voting this election.
So is that still an issue? Because that came up this summer and it seems to have faded as the election got nearer. What do you think?
I wouldn't say that it has faded. I think that people's resolve is there. I think there are a lot of competing issues right now. I mean, we're dealing with myriad of issues around the country. And so I think it's getting consumed by other things, like I said, like the economy, but it's still something that is front and center on many people's minds. And I don't think that that's going to change. We saw recently there was a referendum in Kentucky and women voted to make sure that they could protect access to reproductive health care.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
So are there any kind of economic barriers to voting?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things when we talk about voter suppression, a lot of people say, well, what does that actually look like in real life? And economic barriers are one of those things. It is a voter suppression tool. Think about if you are somebody who is a minimum wage worker, or you're somebody who is a low wage worker, who is an hourly worker, who doesn't have the ability to take the time off to be able to vote. How important is it for that individual to be able to either vote by mail or have the convenience of early voting? And so for women in particular, the economic conditions in their household desperately impact their ability to go vote. And I would also say that it's not just about access to the ballot because you can't take time off from work. It's also the fact that people who are low wage earners often don't have access to the same resources to be educated about their ballot. Think about not having access to the internet. When you think about rural women, for example, where broadband access is still an issue, being able to have that information, sometimes you have to go all the way to a library just to be able to figure out what is it that you need to do. Sometimes you might not have a vehicle if you're living in a rural community to be able to get to your closest polling location. So there are just so many issues that are compounded for people who are low wage earners that the economic factor in it, I just don't think can be understated. The other thing is for senior citizens. We look at the seniors and how they are also, they're a huge voting bloc, but yet at the same time can be disproportionately impacted because many of them are on a fixed income with just Social Security, for example, might not have adequate transportation or the supports they need to be able to go and cast their ballot. So it's definitely a big factor.
But aren't they generally thought of as a reliable voting bloc too?
They are, but it also changes due to the economic status. So depending on where somebody is socioeconomically, your access to the ballot and your ability to cast your vote increases based on income.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the shift in demographics with women. We are hearing a lot about the Hispanic and the Asian suburban women voting. Is this actually happening, or is that a myth?
Well, I will say based on 2020 data, we saw a huge increase in the Hispanic and Latino population at the ballot box. We also saw the same thing around the Asian American community, and the Asian American community, or the AAP, Asian American Pacific Islander community, is the fastest growing population in this country. And so, yeah, there's a huge demographic shift that's happening, and they are voting. And so I think that's something that's really important. It's unfortunate, though. I actually did a session not that long ago with the Asian American caucus, and they were saying how disregarded they are as voters, because again, going back to that, who's asking for your vote, who's asking you to vote, we find that oftentimes they are one of the most overlooked populations.
Wow, that's great. Jody, go ahead.
In terms of demographics, have you seen anything or different in terms of age of voters? Are we seeing more younger folks come out?
So we are, and I'm actually really interested to see what the early voting data is in Georgia in particular, because I think they're one of those states that have really done an amazing job of doing the outreach with young people. So I'm actually really excited. You know, some of this is like, the geeky nerd in me is like really excited to see what the data looks like, especially for a midterm, because, you know, you see those higher numbers usually in a presidential election year. So it's going to be interesting to see, because normally there's kind of that dip for a midterm. People aren't as interested. Voters usually aren't as motivated. But Georgia numbers right now are just ridiculous. They're higher than they've ever been before. And so I'm going to be interested to see what the youth vote looks like. But there was an uptick in youth vote in 2020. So it'll be interesting to see if that levels off, dips, or what happens in the 2022 election. Yeah, it's that roller coaster. But we have seen an increase in youth in the past presidential race. And so we'll see what happens in the midterm if that enthusiasm is still there.
And is that still driven by the younger women versus men going to vote, or is that not an issue?
You know, I'm not really sure, so I don't want to lie to you. I don't have that data on hand, but what I will say is for young people, when you start to ask what is motivating people, climate is their thing, and the economics. I mean, because a lot of young people are looking and they're saying, I'm riddled with student debt. if I'm able to even go to college because of the challenges of even getting into a, university at this point, and because so many young people, especially for young people of color, or maybe usually first generation Americans who are first-time voters, we find that many of those young people have the responsibility of helping out their families as well, right? And so we see a lot of barriers to young people, but economically in this country in ways that we didn't face it when we were younger. I'm a Gen Xer, and I know many of you probably on this call are as well. And so we had different opportunities then, and didn't face the same amount of economic challenges that, say, millennials or Gen Zs are facing right now. And so there is a real shift in momentum around those young people, but the motivating factors are a lot different than what you see when you get into to older demographics.
Interesting.
That's interesting. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Jan. Virginia, my question is around, is there any data or information on who we're voting for, right? Like, are women increasingly more entering political races, entering political life? And I'm just wondering if that is also seen as a potential barrier to voting, right? Am I motivated to vote for an all-male ballot versus the actual issues and how they stand on the issues? Just curious if you're seeing shifting in like who we're voting for and the demographics there. Thank you.
So there's a lot there. So I'll help unpack it a little bit the best that I can. One thing I will say is that we've seen more women elected to Congress, for example, than ever before. We have the largest class of women that came in the last Congress than we had seen ever in the past. I will say that at the state and local level, we still see a lot of challenges with getting women in elected office. And there's a real push right now. I know there are groups like Emily's List and others who are focused on getting women into office, but going back to the economic barriers, what we have found is that it is much harder for women to be able to run for office. Women are not getting money the way that men are when they go to do their fundraising. And it's really, really interesting because women candidates have much more of a challenge fundraising than their male counterparts. And this is a consistent issue. And so whether there is a bias around who is a good candidate, is there a gender bias there? Those are some things that we're really trying to dig into because we found that this is something that is consistently different for women. And so the money aspect, and you can't separate the money in politics issue from women and being able to run for office. And so I would say that that is a huge challenge. And then for women beyond that, the economic barriers of, especially if you're a working woman and you're a woman. So imagine if you want to run for office, but you have a 9-to-5 job, in many cases, it is very difficult to go on the campaign trail when you're just trying to make your ends meet. And most people don't live, unless you're an attorney and you have your own practice, or you're a consultant or in that kind of a role where you can take the time off, or you have the ability to self-fund, it becomes much harder. So it's not that women aren't viable candidates, it's that women aren't invested in the same way in order to be able to be viable. There are campaign finance rules that don't necessarily allow people to be able to pay themselves while they're campaigning, for example. And so we've been thinking about, are there solutions? So is there some kind of a fellowship fund that could be created for women who are running for office, so that way, if they needed to take time off while they're working, they could also be engaged in some sort of a fellowship or work that would allow them to have income coming in the door so that they could actually do that. That's why you see so many octogenarians, right, in Congress. When you look at like what's happening at the federal level, and a lot of even in the state legislatures, I know in a lot of states, if you have a 3-month session, right, a 3-month legislative session, yeah, it's very difficult for people to take 3 months off from work to be, dealing with constituent services and not getting hardly any money to do the work. I mean, each state is very different, but most states don't pay a full-time salary to be able to even be an elected leader. So all of these things are really huge barriers, particularly for women. And then last but not least, I would say another barrier for women comes after they run for office. There are a lot of implications around that. Say in the state of Maryland, where a lot of the legislative work is done in the evenings, right? We know that folks sit in their office. And I use that just because I lived in Maryland for 20 years. So that was kind of my, one of my reference points. But if you're going down and you're trying to work, there's a childcare aspect to this. So even the age of the individuals who can run for office, unless you're a 2-parent home or you have a really great village helping you, it makes it even harder and more complex and difficult for women. And so I don't know if that completely answered your question, but what I can say is there's great enthusiasm and interest among women. We see more women wanting to run, but they're running up against these barriers, these glass walls, so to speak, not necessarily ceilings, right now, but it's the glass wall. They run into it and there's just no door or even a sliding door or a window for them to climb out of because they have all of these things stacked against them. And so we're working with some other partners and organizations who are focusing on women's issues to try and figure out how do we do better? How do we help women and make sure that they have the supports they need to be successful candidates?
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we were prepping for this, you mentioned the Democracy Truth Project. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so Democracy Truth Project is a new project that the League started, and that was just in response to the mis-dis and malinformation. Sometimes there's just pure lies that are coming out of around elections. And so what we've done is really tried to improve upon our civic engagement and engaging people around core truths. And one of the things that we found through some of the studies that we did is that people are more likely to listen to a trusted neighbor, friend, or family member than they are to social media or other folks. Like they'll believe you more if they're sitting and having a conversation with you than they will with somebody on television. So how do we use that human interaction to be able to combat some of the mis and disinformation? And what we found also is that a lot of the people who were engaged in January 6th and the attack on the Capitol, really interesting when you hear from their family members, many of them say, they were radicalized through television. And they've been in these chat rooms and all of these other places, but they had nobody to help counter the narratives that they were hearing. And so we tried to figure out how can we engage with people civically in doing that civic engagement, that civics education, not only for young people, but for adults. There are far too many adults who don't even know pieces of what government is or how the electoral process is supposed to work. We also do it through social media. So we're engaging in TikTok and all of these other places where we're trying to meet people where they're at. And then monitoring some of these dark rooms that exist. There are chat rooms and some other dark places of the web that we need to know what people are saying. I will say one of the things that's interesting, Voto Latino is a partner of ours, and Maria Teresa Kumar, who leads that, who's the president of that organization, is a good friend of mine. And we went through some research around how people were getting radicalized on YouTube, Latinos in particular, because Latino media, for many people, they only get, bits and pieces of information, but there are these really popular quote unquote news shows on YouTube that were radicalizing people and giving them bad information. And so the other thing is calling out bad information when you see it and being able to make sure that we are identifying it, naming it, and correcting it as quickly as we possibly can. So it's an important project for us and one that we're piloting this year, and we plan to expand this work through 2024 because nobody's gotten this right yet. I will say that there are a lot of really smart people who are looking at this, and there is no silver bullet. I think it's going to have to be attacked in a bunch of different ways. And so we're just doing our piece with the civics education in order to combat this as best we can.
Wow, that's a lot of work. Rita, you have a question?
Yes, I'm curious to know whether you have data on what the most effective way to volunteer is. Is it through texting, text banks, or is it letter writing? Is it knocking doors, or just straight up writing a check to the candidate of your choice? I assume all of the above are effective to some extent, but if you have X amount of hours to do volunteer work, what do you think is the most effective volunteering?
So specifically around elections, Rita?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think it depends on what your ability is. I mean, they can all be very effective. We did a pilot program in 2019 and so for us, a lot of this is that nonpartisan get out the vote information piece. So we did a pilot project in New Jersey. They had a gubernatorial race in New Jersey in 2019. And we had two different kind of like quote unquote data sets. We had one cohort of individuals who were getting calls on partisan candidate information. And then we had comparing those with us who were just reaching out and saying, hey, we're not here to talk to you about who you should vote for. We just want to make sure that you have access to the ballot. Are you registered to vote? Do you know where you're supposed to go? Do you have any questions? Do you need help? Do you have a ride? Just asking those questions. And we found that in the comparison group, the folks who we engaged with stayed on the phone with us longer, and they actually showed up to vote more than the people who were getting candidate calls, right? So I think that being able to actually have those human interactions, again, it's that, can you vote? Do you want to vote? Do you need help in figuring out how to vote? That is, I think, one of the key ways that people can engage. I would invite people to, either sign up for the league or another civic engagement group who does that. I think oftentimes people get really turned off by hearing the robocalls and all of the things. Textathons are always great. I think it's easier for people to do that, right? That's an easy way, but any kind of get out the vote efforts are really key. And again, it's what you choose to do. A lot of people are just really jazzed about a certain candidate and might find that that's something that they want to do. But I would say that any way you do it, that those get out the vote efforts are just so critical. And so there's different ways to do it. And I think it just depends on what people's preferences are. But the more people can hear that question, are you going to vote? Do you need help to vote? Those questions really matter. And so I would say the get out the vote efforts are sincerely probably one of the most important things. The other thing I will say around the money, this is at this point, I think I saw, and this was just the other day, it probably has increased at this point. $1.3 billion have been spent on this midterm already.
Whoa.
1.3 billion.
Wow.
Here's the sad part. For organizations like the League, like the Voto Latinos and NAACP, and so many other who are really out here on the ground trying to make sure that voters are getting the information, and we're fighting that good fight, both leading up to elections and in between, so that we can advocate on issues, we're least likely to get a chunk of that money. So when you look at this, we get very, very single digit percentage of that overall amount goes to organizations who are actually doing the work on the ground. So it's really sad for us, because what we see is that there are oftentimes money going to candidates in these races, but a lot of the people who are doing the legwork, the organizations and institutions who are doing the legwork, aren't getting the resources as well. So that's something that is a real challenge.
You don't get any of that money?
So we do fundraising through foundation and through individuals, but I will say our it's like a spit in the bucket, so to speak, compared to what other folks get. And just to give you an idea, our budget is around $14 million a year combined between our education fund and our C4, which is allows us to do our political work, which is for us, a big chunk of money, and we work really hard to raise that. $14 million, that covers all of our work for two entities all year long, not just for elections. And so, and this is not, we're not like an anomaly here. This is happening across the board. I've spoken to so many of our other counterparts in the space, especially women leaders. So this idea of fundraising for women who are running for office, similar for women who run organizations, especially political organizations. It is much harder to fundraise for our work than it is for our male counterparts. I have one friend, and I won't say the organization because I don't want to kind of blow up their spot, but she runs a democracy organization. Her husband runs a democracy organization as well. Check this out. She was pregnant in 2020, and it was just insane. She was pregnant in 2020, and she was going to give birth in December of that year. And the person said to her, and they have the same funder, same donor, who said to her, and didn't know that the two were married because she kept her last name, said to her, well, I don't know if you're going to be able to meet all of the deliverables because you're going to have a baby. And what if the baby comes early? Literally asked her for money back. And the money that she was getting was a fraction, doing amazing work, by the way, amazing work. Her husband had a conversation with the same funder, said, oh, your wife's going to have a baby. Now, this funder did not know that these two are married, said, oh, your wife's about to have a baby. Congratulations. And actually, I want to give you guys some more money. So this is just another example of the sexism that women face in this space, but funding the work actually matters. An organization like the League, so we have more than 700 leagues throughout the country. We're at the local, state, and national level. A lot of our work is done through our volunteer base, but the work that they need to do actually needs to be supported. There's gas money, there's, costs to maintain office space and yard signs, and to do the robocall, to do the calling and all of those things. And so it's just, I'm sorry, I'll get off my horse for a minute, but it's just frustrating how women, and I'm sure for all of you as women leaders have probably experienced so many similar situations in your own work where women are just not invested in the same way that men are.
Oh, that's just putting it mildly. Thank you. Jody, you have a question.
So as a follow-up to that, what did the husband do when he found out what the donor did? Because I think that's a critical part of this conversation.
Yeah, so it was funny. He actually told the donor, by the way, I know you spoke with my wife earlier, and I wanted to just make it clear that I think you should fund us both equally for the same amounts of money because we're both doing really great work. And so she is a really great husband who called the guy in on it. And I'm sure the guy was pretty embarrassed, and
But he got the money.
They both got the money, but imagine not having that happen in that situation.
So groups, and I only know the one, and so there are obviously other groups, but groups like Emily's List and others like that fund candidates. What do we need to do to help them? Or how do we get more money so that women can run and be funded?
Yeah. So, literally the donation piece, the philanthropic piece, and the way that we invest in women matters. And I think that's something that, whether it's the nonpartisan efforts or whether you're focusing on a candidate, making sure that the women have, those organizations have the resources they need to help women, to develop women. Running for office is really hard. It's a process. You have to know how to fundraise. You have to understand media. You have to have all the strategy in place. All of those things require support, training, and development of candidates. And so being able to invest in all those organizations, I think, are critically important. And I'm a girl's girl in the sense that I always want women to win. And so the more that we can invest in women's institutions and organizations and the development of women candidates, for me, it's the better.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. I know that we get really involved when there's an election coming, and then there's another one in 2 years. So this cycle never stops, quite frankly. But it seems like people only want to get involved, and I'm generalizing, around election time. How do we get people to be year-round to stay involved and not just at the elections?
I think the civic engagement piece is really, really critical. And I think one of the best things that I found, or one of the biggest motivating factors for people, is really understanding what gets people out of bed in the morning, or what is that one thing that really agitates you, and providing opportunities for people to engage on those issues. For me, democracy is it's my thing. My husband can't stand it at times because I live and breathe it. I care really so much about that. And so that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And I think that's something that I've done before this job, and I'll continue to do after this because I care about it. But for some people, it might be, abortion access or women's reproductive health. For some people, it may be climate and the environment, gun safety, whatever it is. I think all of those issues connect into or feed into our ability to really engage year round and being able to pass policies and legislation that matter. And I think people just want to be able to have a place to have their voices heard and use their talents in a way that are meaningful to them. For some people, that means being a financial activist because they don't have time to go to a meeting or engage, but they want to be able to be kept up to date and informed on what's happening. For some people, they might say, I can give 2 hours, a month, and I just want to be able to come in and volunteer and at naturalization services and ceremonies and helping people become a registered voter, right? There are just a lot of different ways that people can plug in. My biggest thing is finding those organizations and entities in your community locally where you can really engage in the process. And so whatever that is, for you, again, based on the topical area, but I would say finding organizations that can meet you where you're at based on what you're able to do and how you're able to engage.
That's a good point. Monica.
Am I unmuted? Just checking. Yeah. So thanks, Virginia. Just a quick question. So when I was young, and that was a long time ago, we were taught in school, different civic lessons, and we were taught about voting, and we were taught about the Electoral College and stuff. Does a League of Women Voters go to kids in high school and even, younger children to try to help them understand what democracy looks like and how important it is for them to be involved in it? Do you guys work at that level too?
Yeah, so some leagues do. So one of the things that's great about having, leagues in a lot of communities throughout the country, we're kind of all over the place. So in states like New York, and just to be clear around our structure, we don't dictate what the local or state does around what their core work is outside of the, voter registration, voter education. There are some core issues that we all work on together. But some of the programming they have, so for example, in New York State, they actually supplement New York State's civics education curriculum. So they've come up and developed the civics education curriculum in New York State and making sure that students are getting the information they need. They're going into the schools. We have a high school civics program in many, many states throughout the country where our folks are going in and helping to provide the curriculum and to provide this, because in many cases it's not being taught. So it becomes kind of an extracurricular activity. And so the league is doing kind of that supplemental education work in states all throughout the country and communities all throughout the country. And so in a variety of ways, it's just, sometimes it feels like whack-a-mole, I'll admit, because there isn't that consistency. And honestly, there aren't enough bodies to do it. We need people who can actually implement the curriculum, but where we've been able to partner with school districts, that's where we've been most effective.
Well, I'm just thrilled to hear that there is even civics back in school, because honestly, I think it went away a long time ago. And, learning about the voting process, learning about all of this government, we don't do that anymore. So.
No, but again, in many cases, it's extracurricular or it's part of a summer activity or an after school program. So it's not even as though all students are getting the same. And I mean, this is the United States, right? Each state board of education has different priorities, and we see how educational outcomes are different for children in different places. But it is something. My fear right now, based on how far behind children are around mathematics in particular, based from COVID, and we saw, kind of the loss in learning for so many students. Right now, I'm also fearful that there's going to be more of a decline in civics education because they have to catch kids up, right? I mean, kids are so far behind and they've dropped so significantly. Just reading scores went from 35% to 33% recent polling, recent tests show. And so I think only 28% of kids in the country are actually proficient in math. So when you think about what's happened to our children and how far behind they are educationally, it's really frightening. And so I think, again, it's just really sad because I do fear that civics education will further be put on the back burner in order to be able to replace these other important needs that kids have.
So we have a couple of things in the chat that I want to make people aware of. One is that the league put in here, the Brookings Institute, and running for office is still for men. And so if you want to copy that and look at it at your leisure. And Rebecca has put in here that Sandra Day O'Connor started the site. which is www.icivics.org, some time ago, to help on civics education. And I would love to see civics come back, but that's just me. Well, I have to thank you so much, Virginia. But before we go, I'm going to introduce our IWF-DC president and have her say a few words. Betsy?
Oh, thank you, Jan. And thank you so much, Virginia, for doing this. I run an institute at American University on women in politics. So this is definitely up my alley. And I appreciate you sharing all of your words and the work that the League does is just incredibly important. And so just wanted to say thank you for being an advocate for women and for democracy. Yes. So thanks for being here. And it was great to see so many people dial in. And I loved the format of just being able to have a conversation, which I just think is so valuable. So thank you, Jan, and Monica for coordinating tonight. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. And Virginia, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you're on your way to New Orleans tomorrow and to help with the voting there. So thank you so much.
No, thank you all. It's been a pleasure. Really enjoy. And if you have any follow-up